Welcome to Data Analysis Made Easy with Microsoft Power Tools. That's right, DAME with MPT number 4. Data Analysis with Worksheet Formulas. Yes, that's right. We're going to see when they're the perfect tool, how to use worksheet formulas, and yes, sometimes worksheet formulas, not a pivot table or Power BI, are just the perfect tool. Scenario number 1, when formulas rule. Well, you have an Excel table in the worksheet, and you're adding daily records. And you just want off to the side some visualizations to tell you how things are changing. And part of data analysis with worksheet formulas, sometimes you need to build a single cell formula as the fuel for dynamic visualizations. Scenario number 2 for why worksheet formulas are perfect. Well, the new GROUPBY and PivotBY formulas are so easy for creating single cell report formulas. Sometimes they're going to be easier than the other tools. PivotBY function also. Now, scenario number 3 is the most complicated, but it has the biggest payout. We can use the lambda function to build a reusable function. Then anytime we have data in the worksheet, bam, we just invoke the function we created, and our report is done. The final scenario is data analysis, not when we're going to create a report or visual, but when we want to build a model. Statistical analysis is filled with that. And there's an awesome built-in function called linest, but it is super hard to use. But if we build a lambda, we have a reusable function just like that to deliver all these statistics to build our model. Also, don't forget, not only can you download the Excel workbook and follow along, but there's PDF notes showing many of the steps from the video, great notes about the let function, the GROUPBY and PivotBY function, the lambda function, and much more. All right, so we're on the sheet Enter Data, and here's our first project. A small construction firm remodels houses in the Seattle area, and the proprietor enters daily project time records into the Excel table. And we have 3 data analysis goals. The first, we want to show trend in daily hours worked over the entire data set and a moving 7-day average to smooth out volatility and show the trend. Then we'll create a report and visual to show average hours worked per day of the week, and then create a report and visual to show total hours by project and address. Now, each one of the 1, 2, 3 different formula solutions will be quite different, and we'll talk about the differences as we go along. Now, our data set has date, the project address, time in, time out, and break in hours. Now, all 3 of these are going to need hours, so the very first thing we need to do is add a helper column to this Excel table. We're going to call it hours. And anytime you're calculating number of hours from time in, time out, you always have to ask, are we ever going to go past midnight? And we are. So instead of simply later time minus earlier time times 24, we use the mod function. And in number, we take later time minus earlier time, comma, comma, and in the divisor, we put 1. That formula right there will always calculate the correct time, even if we jump over midnight. Now we have to multiply times 24. When I hit Enter, well, that's sucking the format from here. So I click in the top cell, Control-Shift-Down arrow, Control Backspace to jump back to the active cell. We need to apply general formatting. You can go up to Home, Number, drop down, and there's the eraser. Or you can use the keyboard, Control-Shift, grave accent, or tilde. Let's add some number formatting, because these numbers actually will end up in charts. Control-1, number, and let's show a single digit. Click OK. You know me, I always like to differentiate formula cells from raw data cells. So Control-1, I'm going to add some fill. My favorite green, click OK, OK. Now, that's not quite right. So in the top cell, F2, we need to subtract whatever the breaks, and these are entered in as hours. This whole formula gives us hours, so we simply subtract. And of course, this is an Excel table, so when we enter this, it doesn't spill. It simply automatically copies the formula down. Now that we have our hours, and we want to plot hours over days to see the trend, well, the perfect chart to use when you're plotting any number over time and you want to see the trend, the line chart. But we only want two columns, date and hours. I'm going to click in the top cell, Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace. Then I'm going to hold Control and select the top cell, then hold Shift again, down arrow, Control backspace. And that's a trick to highlight columns not next to each other, non-contiguous columns. Now we go to Insert Chart, Line Chart, and we want this one. Now we need to fix this up a little bit. I'm going to select the chart title, and with the solid line, I type an equal sign because I want to link it to the title in the cell, and Enter. We definitely want to fix up the number formatting on the axes, so I'm going to select the vertical axis, Control 1 to open up the task pane. Down here is number. Let's say 0 decimal and tab. Select date, down to number. And we're going to pick a short one so it's not so cluttered. And that's looking good for the time being. Now notice, lots of volatility. And if you want to see the trend when there's lots of volatility, the best calculation to use is called a moving average. And so we'll add an extra column, and we'll calculate a 7-day moving average. And all that means is that for any point in the chart here, we're going to go back 7 days and average those. Because there's some up and down volatility, it'll tend to flatten out the line, and we can more clearly see the trend. Now let's add a column, 7-day moving average, and Enter. Now we're going to build the formula in a few steps. We'll use the average function. And, well, we need to go 7 days back. Actually, Escape. I had to move the chart. Now we need to go 7 days back. And the first few rows will not have the correct calculation. But once we get to row 7, all the remaining rows will be correct. And we're going to do something here that's very difficult in Power Query and DAX. See, in the worksheet, I'm allowed to select a cell, a whole table, a column, or a range. And so I'm going to go outside the table 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And so when I close parentheses and Enter, sure enough, down here is the first time it's accurate. And this is always the case when you're doing a moving average. Click in the top cell, Control Shift down arrow, Control backspace, Control 1. I do not want all those decimals. Let's say 1 decimal. I also want green fill. And then we click OK. Now, we're going to edit the formula a couple times. But before we do that, I want to plot it inside the chart and see how the line changes when we make the edit. Now, when you want to add a series to a chart, you can select the chart, Chart Design. There it is. Select Data, or right-click, Select Data. And this is the real power to charting in Excel, because we can remove a series, edit, or add. We want add. Series name, there it is. And be careful that array 1 has been with us for decades in Excel. And you got to delete it because it causes trouble. And I want to select the column at the top. There it is. Click OK. Click OK. And there's our line. Now, the trend we can clearly see is looking good, but the first couple values are not correct. Now, let's think about how we would fix this. F2, what we really need is the formula to show nothing until it hits the 7th row. So we use the if function, and we need an incrementer that counts as we go down the rows. And the way you do that is you say rows, and we're sitting in H15. So I type $15 colon H15 close parentheses. This is an expandable range. The row reference 15 is locked on 15. But that row reference is not locked. So as it goes down, this goes to 16, 17, 18, and so on. Rows will always count how many rows are. And so we'll get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. Anytime you are less than 7, comma, then the value of true, well, we want to show nothing. So double quote, that's the syntax to show nothing. Otherwise, row 7 and after, please calculate 7-day moving average. Close parentheses and enter. Well, that's looking good here, but not here. Yeah, that's not going to work at all. Click in the top cell, F2. Now, I did that just to show you because there's a well-known trick that's been around forever with Excel charts. You use an NA, and it will make your table look messy, but it fixes the chart. Control-Enter, and that is cool. And clearly, we can see there's a trend upwards. Now, we could have detected that from the overall up and down because it's going up. But as we get more data, that smoothed out 7-day moving average will help a lot in determining the trend. Now, next we want to report in visual to show average hours worked per day of the week. Well, we don't have an attribute day of the week, but we certainly can create one based on date. So day of the week, enter. And to convert a serial number date into some text, or any number to text, we use the text function. Over in DAX, we use the format function. They both work exactly the same. The value, well, it's going to be that cell reference, comma, and we have to use custom number formatting. Luckily, when it comes to date, Y is for year, M is for month, and D is for date. So if we use 3 Ds, it'll show us the 3-letter abbreviation. And that's our formula. Now we have each row marked with the day of the week, and we can summarize by hour. Now I went ahead and typed out the labels and the days of the week. And this is where we're going to have our formula. But at this point, I want to distinguish between the chart we're going to make from this report right here and the chart we made down here. Remember, this is attached to an Excel table. So when we add new records, all the formulas will be automatically copied down. So this chart always dynamically picks up data when the Excel table object expands. However, this report right here is never going to expand. Just the numbers, the averages will change. So we can literally just type things in the cell and create a single formula. That will be different than our next report, where it's going to depend on new categories added to the table. And that's where we'll have to create a single cell formula. So this is the easiest amongst all. Now we want average, and we have a condition. So we'll use average ifs with an S. The average range, those are the numbers, hours. Comma, criteria range, well, we just created that column right there, comma. And for criteria 1, we'll do a function argument, that's criteria 1, a function argument array operation, because we give it an array of items. That means 7 items. And so average ifs delivers 7 answers, 7 averages, 1 for each day. Not only that, but because the formula delivers multiple answers, when I enter, the results spill down. Now, whereas the Excel table copies the formula down and the formula is in every cell, if I look up in the formula bar, there's the formula. That's the only cell where that formula lives. Each subsequent cell only has a ghost. All right, so we want to add some number formatting. I showed 1 decimal. And just like any data set, we can click in a single cell. And what kind of chart do we want? Well, we're just comparing amounts across categories. And you either use a column chart or a bar chart. That is the visual that best shows differences across categories. So we go to Insert. And I'm going to use a column chart, clustered column, or stacked, as we talked about in an earlier video. There's no difference because there's only one series of numbers. We'll select the title, equal sign. There's our title, and enter. Let's click the vertical axis and delete, because I want data labels at the top of each column. I come up to the green plus, data labels, and guess what? I don't want grid lines. Those grid lines are fine for our line chart because we're going to have a lot of numbers and we want to kind of go across and line things up. But here, I just want the height so we get a visual impression. We can instantly see, yes, Sunday is the biggest. But I also want the detail, so I put data labels at the top. Now for the third, report and visual, we actually want to look at the end result before we create it because that'll help us create it. Now the first thing is this. We have to build a single cell formula that generates the entire report. Because if we want the visual to respect new projects when, over here, they're added to this column, we have to build a single cell formula. Now that's different than up here. We didn't have to do that here because these are never going to change or expand. And the first line chart, well, that was based on the Excel table. And so when it expanded, that chart expands. The next thing we want to notice is how many different parts are there to this report? Well, we need a unique list of projects. Then we need total hours for each project, 1, 2 parts, and then we need a header. That's the third part. So keep that in mind as we build our formula. All right, let's build part number 1 equals, and I want to sort a unique list. These are both dynamic spilled array functions that will give us just what we want. Select the column, close, close, and when I Control Enter, there's our unique list. That's part number 1. Now, F2, the problem with part number 1 is we're going to have to use it multiple times in the same formula. If we just repeated the formula element, it would have to recalculate that each time we use the formula element. Now, what that does is it increases the time that the formula has to calculate to deliver the result. Anytime you have repeating formula elements, there's an amazing function, let. And let, L-E-T, open parentheses, allows us to define variables and then reuse the variable throughout the formula. Now, I'm going to Alt-Enter for each new variable. I'm going to add a new line so it's easy to read. And as we see right here, we can name the variable, and then in the next argument, we say what that variable represents. When naming, you can basically go 2 ways. You could give it a full name, something like unique product list. And now when I type a comma, that variable name represents the formula element in name value 1. The second approach is to abbreviate. And so I am going to do that. I'm going to type unique product, UP. Now we come to the end, and I'm going to comma, Alt, Enter. And here's the rule. If we're using let to define all these variables, how are we going to check each variable? Well, as you create each variable, we're going to use the calculation part of this argument here to test the variable. We'll do that for each variable. And then when we get to the end, the final formula will also go in the calculation area. Up, close parentheses, Control, Enter. So what we've done is we've checked if the up variable is working, and it is. F2. Now I'm going to backspace. We have to get rid of that test variable. Now instead of using calculation like we just did, we're going to use name2. But instead of using name2, I actually want to enter the 2 columns that we're going to use, project and hours, as variables, because we're going to also use those multiple times. Alt-Enter. So for the first variable, I'll just use P for project. There it is, comma, Alt-Enter. The second variable, H for hour, comma, there's hours, comma. The up will be the third variable name. And the sort unique list will be the variable element number 3. Alt-Enter. And the second part of the report, name number 4, that's going to be total hours. And I'll use TH, comma. That formula element that TH represents, well, we need to add with a condition. So I'm going to use some ifs. Sum range, well, we would like to select H, but guess what? We already have a variable H, so we type H, comma. Criteria range, well, we want to select project, but we already have a variable P, comma. And we need to do, just like with average ifs, we need to do a function argument array operation to get the total for each unique product. So what do we use? We use the variable up, close parentheses, comma, alt, enter, and we need to test. th, close parentheses, and control, enter. And there it is. That's the second part of our report, total hours. All right, we have the first two parts of our report, F2, and we want to backspace and always make sure to get rid of the test variable in calculation. If you leave it there, your formula will not work. Now we want name 5. And the third element, those are the report headers. So I'll type RH for report header, comma. And we need two names, column 1, column 2, and we need to list them horizontally. When you're hard coding values into a formula and you have multiple items, an array of items, you use array syntax. Curly brackets house the array. The first element we want is text. So in double quotes, project in double quotes. Now, that's only the first element in the array. You can have an array with a single item, but we have multiple items. Now, remember in Excel, we can either have an array across the columns or down the rows. When you want the values to spill across the columns, you use a comma. And the way I remember that is comma starts with C, column starts with C. As we'll see in a later example, semicolon means go down a row. And then double quotes, total hours, and double quote, and then close curly bracket. That's an array of two text items that's going to spill across the columns. Comma, alt, enter. Report header to test it, close parentheses, control, enter. And that's beautiful. That's our third element. F2. Now all we need to do is join the three elements together. Now, when we join two different elements, criteria and numbers, we're joining horizontally. When we join field names to the report, we're joining vertically. Now, down here, we're finally going to use the calculation argument to deliver the final formula. And we need to join things horizontally, so we use the function HSTACK. And for array 1, we want unique products. And notice that x, that means a variable we're allowed to use throughout the let function, comma, and then th, there's our variable, close on HSTACK, close on the calculation argument on let, control enter. Wow, that is amazing. We join things horizontally. F2. Now we take that, and we're going to nest HSTACK inside of VSTACK. Array 1, report header, comma. Array 2, that's the two things we joined horizontally. Now, earlier I forgot to change in unique. Let's click, and we'll put our variable p. And now we have our final formula sitting in calculation. When I close parentheses and control enter, there's our single cell report. Any chart we point to the single cell spilled formula will update when we add new projects. Now, before we add some formatting, let's go ahead and create our visualization. And I'm going to use a bar chart. Now, I created this bar chart. And the reason I chose bar chart over column is when you have really long labels like this, then we don't get any wrapping as we would if we used a column chart. The other difference between these two is sometimes a horizontal, because it's longer than it is taller, will emphasize the differences more forcefully. Now, I don't want decimals here. And let's check this out. We're going to watch what happens here. And we're going to add conditional formatting. So I want to add number formatting before we do the conditional formatting. And with conditional formatting, before you apply it, you have to select enough rows to accommodate any future changes. So I'm going to select down to row 30, Control 1. Now, I did 0 decimals, but watch what happens here and here. Click OK. Well, there's a setting over in our task pane that says, hey, I'm going to connect the number formatting to whatever's in the cells. All right, so we're going to push these off to the side. And now we want to talk about something really important for dynamic spilled reporting formulas, and that is conditional formatting. So once you spend the time creating your report and everything's going to change over time, it's worth the effort to add conditional formatting. Now, for the first row, we don't need conditional formatting because it's always going to be the first row. So I'm going to add bold. And the number formatting, too, we do that in advance. But what I want, and I'm going to highlight all the way down to row 30, is anytime the cell is not empty, or as we'll see in conditional formatting, it calls it blank, I want to add a border. Down here, because it is blank, I don't want any formatting. Home, styles, conditional formatting, and we're definitely going to add a new rule. And there is a built-in feature. So this one is format only cells that contain no blanks. Then you can format it however you'd like. You can use all 4 tabs. I'm just adding border for now. And because conditional formatting applies to every single individual cell, the rule applies to each cell. That's why we're just doing outline. Click OK, click OK. And when we add data in just a moment, we'll see, or hopefully we'll see, that the formatting updates. But before we update that, it would be nice to have this column sorted biggest to smallest in the top cell F2. We want to come before HSTACK with the 2 columns, and we're going to sort. And very carefully, there's HSTACK at the end, comma. Sort index. I want to sort the second column, so 2, comma. And I want it biggest to smallest, so -1, close parentheses, Control Enter, and that's looking much better. All right, here's the moment of truth. Now, the proprietor will just be adding records each day, but I have some data below. I'm going to highlight all that data. This is an Excel table, so I'll use my move cursor. And before I let go, now I'm looking up at everything. Bam! Everything updates. The dynamic spilled array formula expanded. Conditional formatting to look at that line chart. And even this one, pointing to that dynamic spilled array formula, updated perfectly. Now, that was example number 1. But example number 2, remember, it's the GROUPBY function. Now, we created this. And that's considered old school if you have GROUPBY. Now, I'm filming this on May 3rd, 2024. And GROUPBY is still in beta. But when it comes out, this is how easy it's going to be. GROUPBY. Now, row fields, that's the column that you select where, just like a pivot table, it'll extract a unique list of conditions or criteria. And you can put one or more fields there. We're simply going to put product. Now, whereas GROUPBY only does row conditions like at the front of a pivot table, PivotBy does row conditions and column conditions. Now we do comma. Values, that's the column that has the values that you want to aggregate. We want hours. And you can put one or more columns here also, comma. And then the function. Now, we can simply type sum. But anytime you see the argument function in any function inside Excel, it means you can put lambda there. Now, we haven't talked about lambda yet, but lambda allows you to define functions. Now, luckily, there's some eta lambdas, which allow us to simply type the word sum or average, and it's a substitute for lambda, and that will be our aggregate calculation, comma. The next argument asks, well, when we highlighted the data, did it have field names? We do not have field names, so we type 0, comma, and we get to total depth. This function, believe it or not, can add a total row. And if you have more than one condition in the row area, you can actually add subtotals. Now, we don't want a total for this particular application, because if we had a total row, that would mess up the chart. So we're going to put 0, comma. Now we can sort. And this is different than the sort function. Well, if we put a 2 for sort, it knows to sort the second column. But in sort, we had to jump to the next argument to say sort biggest to smallest. Here, +2 means, hey, sort smallest to biggest. And if we use a negative number, it means biggest to smallest. So we'll put -2. Now, the filter array allows us to filter, but we're not going to do that. So close parentheses, and that simple formula, when I Control-Enter, that is amazing. So much easier than this formula up here. Now, F2, GROUPBY can add headers to the report, but the headers are not very good. And we'll see an example of that later. So we're going to add headers ourselves using VStack. So just as we did up here, there's our headers, there's our GROUPBY, Control-Enter. Now, I'd like to add some formatting. And if I highlight this up here, remember we did 3 kinds of formatting. We did bold, number formatting, and conditional formatting. If I right-click, I go up to Format Painter, click, that loads the paintbrush. I come down, and when I click at the top, the conditional formatting, the bold at the top, and the number formatting are all applied. So GROUPBY, even if we have to do VStack, so much easier than this formula here. Now, let's go look at some other examples of GROUPBY. All right, for this GROUPBY, we're going to include 2 columns in the row area, and we're going to have 2 columns for values. Equals GROUPBY. Row fields, we're also going to include the field names, so sales rep and product, comma. For values, for the time being, we're just going to have 1 column. And I am going to include the field name at the top, comma. We'll do the function sum, comma. And for field headers, we want to choose 3. Yes, we have field names in the columns we selected, and I want to show them in the report. So 3, close parentheses, Control-Enter. Well, they gave us field names for the row area, but there's no label for the calculation. I don't know what column it is or what the calculation is. Now, before we fix it, let's look at subtotals. So backspace, comma. And we want 2. We want grand total at the bottom and subtotal. So 2, Control-Enter. Well, that's pretty cool. Subtotals and a grand total. Now let's add a second column to values. We want to select sales and cost of goods sold, including the field names. And when I Control-Enter, well, now it lists all the field names, but we still have no idea what the calculation is. All right, we're going to start over. In row fields, we want 2 fields, and I do not want the field names. So we have sales rep and product, comma. For values, we want sales and cost of goods sold, comma. The function will be sum, comma. We don't have any headers, and we don't want any. We can actually skip this, and it will assume 0. Total, we definitely want subtotal, so I'm going to put 2. Comma, and I do want to sort. I want to sort the third column, which will be sales. So -3, so the biggest one comes to the top. Close parentheses, Control-Enter. Well, that's looking good, but now we need headers, F2. Now, I went ahead and added GROUPBY in Array 2, and I got to show you a great trick for creating the array syntax for our headers in Array 1. I'm going to select the field names, and notice those are almost correct. All we need is sum of for both of these. We select array, and we can use the F9 key, which is evaluate, F9. And just like that, it hard codes or converts the values across the columns into array syntax, including, of course, knowing that columns are commas. So now we just type sum of for both of those fields. And when we Control-Enter, now we have our finished report. Now for the finished report, let's add conditional formatting. And I'm going to highlight a bunch of rows below. And for this conditional formatting, I want to add bold to the subtotal row and double underline for the grand total row. Now, when you apply conditional formatting to the row, you have to use a formula, and you have to use mixed cell references. Now, the pattern that we'll use to highlight each subtotal row is we'll recognize that in the J column, there's an empty cell. To add the double underline, we'll recognize that in the I column, there's the word grand total. Now, when we highlight, we want to make sure that the upper left corner is selected. Home, conditional formatting, new rule, formula. And for our formula, we're going to select J4. And then we have to use the F4 key once and twice to lock the column, but not the row reference. That means when the formula in memory is copied over, it's always locked on J. But when it goes down to the next row, the row reference is allowed to move. And I'm going to say equal sign equals double quote. That's the syntax for an empty cell. Format, and I want simple bold. Click OK, click OK. And that is working. For the next rule, we'll select I4, F4 twice, and we'll ask the question, do you have grand total in the cell? Format, and we're going to use font and double accounting underline. Click OK, click OK. Now we can add bold here, Control B. And now let's add some new data down here. Drag it up. And just like that, the report has updated. All right, for this example, I want to see how to use two different functions. We're going to use the same two conditional columns for the row area, comma, values. We're going to use a single column, sales, comma. And for the function, if we want to, we have to manually join them using HSTACK. Then we can use sum, average, close parentheses, comma. We don't have any headers, so 0, comma. And we want 2 for subtotals. We don't need to sort, close parentheses, Control, Enter. No field names, and just the name of the calculation. Now, it's important to understand that if we were to try and select 2 columns, and I don't know why Microsoft programmed it this way, we would think we'd get sum and average. But that's not the way it works. Both calculations are done on sales. So we're simply going to use a single column. Now, if I want to add headers, I have to get rid of this first row, F2. And luckily, there's a great function called drop. There's the array, and comma for row. Positive number takes rows from the top. Negative numbers take from the bottom. Similar for columns, positive, negative. I just want to remove the top one, close parentheses, Control, Enter. And there's our report without those silly headers. So I've added the headers, Control, Enter. And there's our report. And after I add the conditional formatting, bam, it's all done. All right, PivotBy. The only difference in arguments is we definitely have a column field and a row field. And when it gets to total, we have row and column. Sort, we have row and column. All right, let's see how fast we can create a crosstab. Row fields, we're going to do region. And I am going to include the field names because the PivotBy is a little bit more polite when it comes to headers than GROUPBY. We're going to use product in the column, comma, sales, comma, the function will do sum, comma, and I definitely want, yes, I have headers and I want you to show them. Close parentheses, Control, Enter, and bam, we have a crosstab just like that. And these two labels are not so bad. Now, I would like a label here that says sum of sales. And the way we're going to do this is F2. I'm going to use the let function. We'll call the crosstab CT, comma, at the end, comma, Alt, Enter. And what I want to do is I want to count how many rows and columns there are. So R, and then we'll use rows of CT, comma, Alt, Enter, and we'll check what R is. Sure enough, it's 9, F2. Backspace, and we want to count the columns. So columns of the crosstab, and we'll check column. There are 8, F2. And now I want a sequence of numbers. So S, comma, sequence. For row, I want R, comma. For column, I want C. Close parentheses, comma, Alt, Enter. We'll check S. Control Enter, 1 to 72. And now I'm simply going to say if one of these numbers equals 1, put a label. Otherwise, deposit the cross-tab report. So for the formula, if S equals 1, then sum of sales, otherwise cross-tab. Close parentheses, Control Enter, and that's looking good. Now, if I want to add some formatting, I actually don't need to do conditional formatting because this is always going to go down, over, and these numbers will go diagonally. So I'm going to Control B. Similarly over here, Control B. And then highlight enough cells to accommodate everything. 2 decimals is OK. Click OK. Look at that. I misspelled of. But that's easy to fix. I'm going to highlight these two, Control B, Control U for an underline. Control B, right-click, and I'm going to add a font color red. Now let's test it by adding some new data. And bam, just like that, our cross-tab has updated. Now, the third scenario for when formulas are great for data analysis is, well, you've decided that you want to use this reporting formula over and over. We can use the lambda function to take this function and convert it into a reusable function. Let's go over to the sheet lambda. Now, here's the same formula and the same data set. And we want to come up after the equal sign and type lambda, open parentheses, Alt, Enter. And what lambda does is it requires parameters and then some final calculation. The names you give to the parameters will show up as the function arguments in the screen tip for the function. And the formula that you put in calculation, that's what the reusable function will do each time you call it. So the let function has 1, 2, 3 inputs. So up in lambda, we're going to have 3 names for parameters or the eventual function arguments that will show up in the screen tip. So we'll create the 3 function argument names. So I created 3 parameters or function argument names, row header, column header, and value header. Now we need to get lambda to communicate with let. And we're actually going to have to define the same 3 variables in let. Alt, Enter. And because these will be in the screen tip, we should use the full name so someone reading it understands. But inside let, we can use abbreviations. I'm going to use RF for row field, and then copy this and paste it here, comma, Alt, Enter, column field, comma. We'll copy this and put it for CF, comma, Alt, Enter, VF for value field. We'll copy, Control V, comma. Now, to get all of this formula to communicate with lambda, which communicates with the person who's using the function, we have to list these 3 variables in the correct location. So double-click RF, double-click CF, double-click VF, and that should do it. Now, testing lambda is a little bit tricky, but watch this. Close parentheses. If you enter it now, it just gives you an error. But we want to test it. We have to pretend that this is a function. And what do you do when you have a function? You open parentheses. Then in the correct order, we need to put 1, 2, 3 arguments. Now I'm going to pick region, including the field name, comma, and then sales rep. And for the values, we'll choose sales. Now here's the moment of truth. Close parentheses. We're testing lambda. And sure enough, it does work. Now notice it says sum of sales, and we want someone to be able to pick whichever value column, so F2. And we want to create a dynamic label from the top of whatever values column we select. So I'm going to come after VF, Alt, Enter, and we're going to call this VFN for name, comma. And what we want is the first row from this variable. And there's a great function which is parallel to drop, take, and there it is, the array. We're going to put VF in, comma, and rows, positive number takes rows from the top, negative numbers takes rows from the bottom. 1, because we only want the top, close parentheses, comma, and then down here, instead of all text, we're going to end double quote, ampersand, value field name. And now when we Control Enter, at least it's not broken, F2, but let's change the values column. So we're going to try cost of goods sold, and when we Control Enter, that is beautiful. F2. Now, where do we save this so that we can use it over and over? We save it in Define Names. So I'm going to highlight everything except for the part that was testing. Copy, Enter, and Define Names are up in Formulas over to Name Manager, or the keyboard, Control F3. We want New. We want to give it a name so that when we see it in the function list, it'll make sense. Something like Crosstab Report. And then down here, we're going to highlight, delete, and Control V. And we definitely want to give it a description here, because this will also show up when we invoke the function. There's the description. And at the end, I put, hey, the crosstab is doing a sum. I also added sum to the end of the function name. Now let's click OK. There it is in our defined name list. Click Close. And now let's try our crosstab function. There it is. And look at the screen tip. It describes exactly what it does. Tab. There are the function arguments we created in the screen tip. Row with headers. Let's do sales rep, comma, column header, region, comma, values. Let's try cost of goods sold. And that's it. Close parentheses. And that beautiful function we just created, Control Enter, bam, it creates a crosstab report with the correct labels at the top. Now, if you do data analysis with worksheet formulas, Lambda, and the ability to create your own function for reporting, that's a game changer. All right, scenario number 4. Let's go over to the sheet Stats. Now, statistics takes raw data and creates useful information. In this case, not a report or a visual, but these statistics help us make a model that we can use for decision making. Now, in simple linear regression, we have an x and a y, and we build a model to predict. And this function is amazing. Line est, or line straight. This function's been around for decades. But when you enter y and x, it just blindly delivers 10 different statistics. It doesn't even put these labels. So when I've used it in the past, I use it, I type the labels, and then I build my model. But what we want to do is we want to build a single Lambda function that just delivers it vertically, all the labels and all the numbers. Now, before we create our Lambda, you want to copy these, all the labels, and put them vertically in the cells. All right, so we create Lambda, and there's only 2 inputs for line st, y values and x values. Alt-Enter. We now need to use let, Alt-Enter. And inside let, it makes sense to use a simple variable. Y will represent y values. X will represent x values. Alt-Enter. Headers, comma. And I'm going to highlight all of these. And just like we did earlier, I don't want to type them out, so I'm going to hit F9. And they're already in the perfect array syntax, including the semicolons, which means go down a row. Now we come to the end, comma, Alt-Enter. We'll call this variable s for statistics. Then we'll use line est. We put in y variable first, comma, x variable, comma 1, comma 1, close parentheses. Now remember, line s delivers 2 columns, and we want it all delivered in a single column. So we'll use a great function called toCall. It'll take whatever we put in the array and put it into a column. Now, by default, it goes row by row, but we want it to take the first column and then the second column and put it into a column. So we put 1, close parentheses, comma, Alt-Enter. Now we can HSTACK, horizontally stack up header, comma, statistics, close on let, close on lambda, open parentheses to test it, and we'll put in y, comma, we'll put in x, close parentheses, control, enter. And that is looking good. F2, we want to copy everything except for the part that we tested. Control C, enter. Control F3. All right, we gave it a good description. That'll be the name of the function. We click OK. There it is in our list. Close. Now we'll test and see if our new lambda regression function is working. We'll put in y's, comma, we'll put in the x values, close parentheses, control enter. And just like that, we have our statistics, and we can build our model. Now, this data, our study test score, we collected past data. I'm going to put in 15 hours of studying for this big test. The model says I'll get 83. How about if I'm a slacker and I only study 10? Well, according to this model, I'm probably not going to do very good. Let's go over to Stats 2. Here's a different data set, weekly ads and weekly sales. We're hoping there's a direct or positive relationship between how much we spend on ads and the resulting sales. We'll put in our y values, our x values, close parentheses, control enter, and there we have our statistics to build our model. All right, in this video, we talked about worksheet formulas and data analysis. Certainly, one situation where worksheet formulas are awesome is when we're doing statistics. The lambda function is a game changer. We can create very complex reporting formulas, and then using them is easy. We talked about the PivotBy function, the GROUPBY function, and we started it off with probably the most common situation where we're going to do data analysis based on worksheet formulas. We're just entering data, and we need some analysis off to the side. All right, we'll see you next Dame with MPT video.